What if one of the most famous symbols in human history is not a symbol at all? What if yin and yang is actually a description of reality itself? And if that's true, then a much more uncomfortable question follows. Why does every good thing seem to contain the seed of something bad? Why does every victory create a loss? Why does every strength become a weakness if pushed too far? Don't answer that yet. In fact, don't expect an answer for a while. By the end of this journey, after thousands of years of ideas, the answer may begin to reveal itself. But only if you stay with me until the end. And before we begin, if you enjoy videos about ancient China, philosophy, and long, sleep-friendly journeys like this one, take a moment to leave a like now. It helps the channel enormously and lets me know you'd like to see more videos like this. Hello. Welcome to Maybe Meaning. Maybe you found this by accident. Maybe you were looking for something to help you sleep. And you ended up here on a channel about philosophy, about questions that don't quite have answers. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Tonight we are going to spend 2 hours with one of the oldest ideas humanity has ever had. Not a theory, not a religion, not a moral code. Something stranger and simpler than all of those. The idea is this, that everything that exists comes in two halves. That light cannot exist without darkness, that good cannot be defined without evil, that you cannot know yourself without also knowing your shadow. It is the idea of yin and yang. You have seen the symbol, black and white curling around each other, a dot of white in the black, a dot of black in the white. Simple enough to draw in the corner of a notebook, ancient enough that nobody knows exactly when it was first drawn. But tonight we are not going to look at the symbol. We are going to look at what the symbol is pointing at. We are going to ask whether it is actually true, whether the universe really is built this way, whether science agrees, whether your own mind agrees, whether the idea holds up when we press on it seriously, the way philosophers press on things, the way physicists press on things, the way you press on an old wound to see if it still hurts. And along the way, we are going to run into some genuinely uncomfortable questions. Questions about whether good and evil are real or just two sides of the same thing. Whether balance is something you find or something you build. Whether the darkness inside you is your enemy or your other half. You don't need to answer those questions tonight. You just need to listen. Let your body get heavy. Let your thoughts slow down. Let the words wash over you like water. We have a long way to travel. 13 chapters. Thousands of years. From a hillside in ancient China to a laboratory in Copenhagen to the inside of your own mind at 3 a.m. Let's begin. Before the Tao Te Ching and the scholars and the centuries of commentary, there was just a hill and a farmer standing at the edge of a field, watching the light move. This is where it started, not in a temple, not in a university. In the most ordinary possible observation that one side of a hill is sunny and one side is in shadow, and that both sides exist together at the same time, as part of the same hill. In ancient Chinese, the word yin meant the shaded, north-facing slope, the cool side, the side where the sun did not reach. Yang meant the bright, south-facing slope, the warm side, the side where the sun arrived first in the morning and stayed the longest. These were not metaphors to begin with. They were descriptions of physical, observable reality. But then, as always happens with observations that are precise enough, the idea began to expand. If yin is shadow and yang is light, then what about night and day? Night is yin, day is yang. What about summer and winter? Winter is yin, summer is yang. What about water and fire? Water is yin, fire is yang. What about the feminine and the masculine, the receptive and the assertive, the empty and the full, the soft and the hard, the slow and the fast? Yin, yang, yin, yang, yin, yang. And then the observation that changed everything. These opposites were not fighting each other. They were not enemies, they were partners. Each one required the other to exist, not merely as a convenient contrast, but as an actual logical necessity. Think about it carefully. Can you experience warmth without ever having been cold? Not merely theoretically, actually experience it, feel it, know it in your body. If you had lived your entire life at the same temperature, warmth would not be warmth. It would just be the way things are. The existence of warmth as a sensation, as a quality you can perceive and name and feel grateful for, depends entirely on the existence of cold. This is not a small point. It is, in fact, the central point. Without the opposition, the experience vanishes. The quality ceases to exist as a quality. It dissolves back into an undifferentiated grey, in which nothing has a name and nothing can be felt. The ancient Chinese thinkers called this the Great Void, the state before the division into Yin and Yang. The state the Taoists would later call the Tao, the unnameable origin from which all things emerge. And what emerged from that undifferentiated origin? Two. Always two. Always these two particular patterns, these two ways of being, spiraling around each other like the two sides of a wave, receiving and asserting, contracting and expanding, resting and moving, dark and bright. This is not a theory about two types of things. It is a theory about the structure of reality itself. It says, nothing you can name, nothing you can experience, nothing you can measure exists in isolation. Everything that is what it is only in relation to what it is not. The farmer on the hillside did not need to know philosophy to understand this. He could see it. Every morning, the shadow moved. Every season, the mountain changed faces. Every year, what had been frozen became flowing, and what had been flowing became frozen again. This was not a problem to be solved. This was the way things were. This was, as the ancient Chinese said, the way. And from this simplest of observations, one of the most profound intellectual traditions in human history slowly began to grow. Sometime in the Song dynasty, about 1,000 years ago, a diagram appeared. It was called the Taijitu, the diagram of the supreme ultimate. You know it. Almost everyone knows it. A circle divided by a curved line into two halves, one dark and one light, each containing a small circle of the opposite color. But most people do not know the full story of what this diagram is actually trying to say. The first thing to understand is that the curved line dividing the two halves is not a wall. It is not a border. It is a wave. In the original Chinese understanding, the division between yin and yang is never static. It is always in motion, like the line between day and night as the earth rotates, like the line between the inhale and the exhale, like the line between sleeping and waking, which you may be approaching even now as the words begin to feel further away. The line curves because the two sides are always flowing into each other. They are not cut apart. They are braided. The second thing to understand is the small circles, the white dot inside the black half, the black dot inside the white half. This is the part most people miss, and it is the most important part. The Taijitu is saying, inside every yin, there is a seed of yang. Inside every yang, there is a seed of yin. Nothing is purely one thing. Nothing is completely without its opposite. Even at the height of summer, at the exact moment of maximum yang energy, there is already the beginning of yin, the first tiny turn back toward darkness. Even at the depth of winter, in the coldest and most yin of all moments, there is already the seed of spring, the first stirring of what will become yang again. Think about joy, real joy, deep joy, the kind that sometimes arrives unexpectedly and makes your chest ache. Have you noticed that it always contains a thread of sadness? That when you feel most happy, most alive, most fully present, there is also an awareness, somewhere behind the happiness, of how temporary it is, of how much you want to hold on to it, and how impossible that is. That is the black dot in the white half. And conversely, think about grief, real grief, the kind that settles into you and stays for months. Have you noticed that even in grief, even in the darkest and most yin of emotional states, there are moments of unexpected beauty? The way a particular light comes through a window, the way a friend says exactly the right thing, the way a memory arrives that is painful and precious at the same time. That is the white dot in the black half. The Taijitu is not saying that life is balanced in the sense of pleasant and fair. It is saying that life is balanced in a much deeper and stranger sense. It is saying that the very qualities you think of as opposites actually contain each other, that they are not enemies but mirror images, each one incomplete without the other. The third thing to understand about the symbol is its shape, a circle. The whole thing is contained within a circle, and that circle represents what the Taoists called the Tao itself, the undivided whole, the origin from which both yin and yang emerge, the thing that is neither one nor the other but contains both. The philosopher Alan Watts, who spent much of his life translating Eastern philosophy for Western audiences, used to say that the Tao is like the dancing, not the dancer. It is the activity, the movement, the dynamic process, not the thing doing the moving. Yin and Yang are how the Tao dances, the two patterns into which the energy of existence naturally organizes itself, the two rhythms of the one song, and the circle tells us this is not a conflict. This is a performance, and it has no beginning and no end. The diagram that 1,000 years ago seemed like a simple piece of mysticism turns out to be one of the most precise visual representations ever created of something that physicists would not begin to discover until the 20th century. But we are not there yet. First, let us go deeper into the ancient world. About 2,500 years ago, according to tradition, an old man was leaving China. His name was Lao Tzu, or perhaps it was not. The name means something like the old master, or even the old boy, and scholars are not sure whether it referred to a specific historical person, a composite of several thinkers, or a mythological figure constructed to give authority to ideas that emerged from a community. The story says that Lao Tzu had served as a keeper of archives in the royal court of the Zhou dynasty. He had watched the decline of the dynasty. He had watched the moral and political decay of the civilization he had served, and at some point he had decided to leave. He saddled a water buffalo and rode toward the western border of China, toward the wilderness beyond. At the border, a gatekeeper named Yin Shi stopped him. Yin Shi recognized the old man as a sage and begged him not to leave without writing something down, without leaving some record of his wisdom. Lao Tzu paused, and then, according to the tradition, he sat down and wrote approximately 5,000 Chinese characters. He handed the text to Yin Shi, rode through the gate, and was never seen again. Those 5,000 characters became the Tao Te Ching. It is one of the most translated books in human history, second only to the Bible, some scholars claim, and it is not easy to translate because it resists easy interpretation. It is written in a style that is deliberately paradoxical, deliberately slippery, deliberately resistant to being pinned down. The very first line is, "The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao," which is a remarkable way to begin a book about the Tao. It is saying, what I am about to describe cannot actually be described. What I am about to name cannot actually be named. The map I am drawing for you is not the territory. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. This is not mystical vagueness. It is philosophical precision of the highest order. The Tao is the ground of all existence, the source before all sources, the category that contains all other categories, and any word you use to describe it is already inside it, already one of the things it contains. You cannot step outside the Tao to look at it from the outside, because there is no outside. In chapter 42, Lao Tzu writes his most explicit statement about Yin and Yang. The Tao produced one, one produced two, two produced three, three produced the 10,000 things, All things carry yin yet embrace yang. They blend their life breaths in order to produce harmony. This is one of the most compact cosmological statements in any philosophical tradition. The Tao is the undifferentiated whole, one. Then from that wholeness, the first division, Yin and Yang. Two, from the interaction of Yin and Yang, the creative tension, the dynamic dance. A third thing emerges, the harmony that is more than either one, free. And from that threefold creative process, everything that exists. The 10,000 things. All of reality. Notice that yin and yang do not fight each other. They do not cancel each other out. Their interaction produces something. Reality itself is the product of their dance. But Lao Tzu is even more radical than this. In chapter 2, he writes, "When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad." He is not saying that beauty is subjective in the modern relativist sense. He is saying something more fundamental. He is saying that beauty and ugliness are not two separate qualities that happen to coexist. They are the same quality, seen from two different angles. You cannot have one without the other. The judgment that creates beauty simultaneously creates ugliness. The perception that defines good simultaneously defines evil. This is deeply uncomfortable if you sit with it for a moment. It means that if you want to eliminate evil, you simultaneously eliminate your capacity to recognize good. If you want to banish darkness completely, you also banish the light, because light only means something in the presence of darkness. It means that every attempt to purify the world of one half of reality is doomed not just to fail, but to backfire, to create more of what you are trying to eliminate. Lao Tzu watched the rulers of the Zhou dynasty trying to impose order, and he saw that their imposition of order was creating chaos. Their assertion of virtue was creating corruption. Their pursuit of strength was creating weakness. Because yin contains the seed of yang, because the extreme of any quality always carries within it the seed of its opposite. And the way, the Tao, the path of wisdom, is not to try to eliminate one side or the other. It is to move with the natural rhythm of their alternation, to know when to be yin and when to be yang, to be flexible enough to embody either quality at the right moment, rather than rigidly committed to one at the expense of the other. This philosophy is called Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, though effortless action or action in accordance with the flow of things is closer. It does not mean doing nothing. It means doing the thing that the situation calls for, without forcing, without resistance, without insisting that reality conform to your idea of how it should be. Water is the great example. Water is yin. It is soft, yielding, flowing, formless. It takes the shape of whatever container holds it. It flows around obstacles rather than through them. And yet, water wears away stone. Water carves canyons. Water, over time, defeats the hardest and most yang of substances, not through force, through persistence, through yielding. The soft overcomes the hard. The yielding overcomes the rigid. This is the paradox at the heart of Taoist wisdom. And it is not merely philosophical. It has practical implications for how you live, how you relate to other people, how you navigate difficulty, and how you find peace in a world that is never going to be what you want it to be all of the time. Long before the Tao Te Ching, there was another text, older, stranger, more deeply embedded in the daily life of ancient China. The I Ching, the Book of Changes. It is usually described as a divination manual, which is technically accurate but deeply misleading in the way that describing the ocean as a large body of salt water is technically accurate and deeply misleading. It sounds like a fortune-telling device, which makes it easy to dismiss. But the I Ching is actually something much more interesting. A systematic attempt to map the grammar of change itself. Here is how it works. All of reality, the I Ching says, can be understood in terms of combinations of yin and yang, 2 qualities, 6 positions, 64 combinations. The basic unit is a line. A yang line is solid and unbroken. A yin line is broken in the middle. 3 lines stacked on top of each other create a trigram, and there are 8 possible trigrams. 2 trigrams stacked on top of each other create a hexagram, and there are 64 possible hexagrams. Each hexagram represents a particular configuration of yin and yang energies, a particular moment in the dynamic process of change, and each hexagram contains the seeds of its transformation into other hexagrams, because yin lines can become yang and yang lines can become yin. The I Ching is not trying to predict what will happen, it is trying to describe where you are in the cycle of change, and what that position suggests about what is likely to emerge next. And the fundamental insight underlying the whole system is one that sounds simple and is actually revolutionary. Nothing is permanent. Every configuration of energy is already in the process of becoming something else. The hexagram of your current situation already contains the seeds of its own transformation. This does not mean that change is inevitable in a pessimistic sense. It means that change is the nature of reality in a clarifying sense. The winter is not a mistake. It is not a disaster to be solved. It is a phase of the cycle. And knowing where you are in the cycle changes how you experience your position. If you are in a hexagram of difficulty, the I Ching is not telling you that things are bad. It is telling you that this is a yin phase, and that within a yin phase, the yang is already growing. The seed is already there. The question is not whether things will change, but how you will navigate the change when it comes. The scholar Richard Wilhelm, who produced one of the most influential translations of the I Ching, wrote that the book's central teaching is not a moral teaching, but a cosmological one. It is not telling you to be good. It is telling you to be in rhythm, to understand the pattern of change deeply enough that you can move with it rather than against it. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who we will spend more time with later in this journey, was so fascinated by the I Ching that he wrote an extended preface to Wilhelm's translation. He saw in it something that Western psychology was only beginning to understand, that the psyche, like the universe, operates in cycles, that there are yin phases of the mind and yang phases, that both are necessary and neither is pathological. The I Ching is also interesting because of the concept of the changing line. When you consult the I Ching, some of the lines you generate are stable, and some are in the process of changing from yin to yang, or from yang to yin. The changing lines are the most important. They are the pivot points, the places where the energy is most dynamic, most alive, most pregnant with transformation. And here is the question the I Ching invites you to sit with. In your own life right now, what are the changing lines? What is in the process of turning? What was yin and is becoming yang? What was yang and is becoming yang? What was yang and is becoming yang? Not because you need to do anything about it, but because recognizing the change that is already happening is a form of wisdom. It is the difference between being carried by the river unknowingly and floating consciously on the same river, aware of the current, aware of where the bends are, able to lean into turns instead of fighting them. The Book of Changes does not promise that you can control the river. It promises something more useful, that if you understand the grammar of flow, you will be less likely to drown. In traditional Chinese medicine, the body is not a machine. It is a landscape, and like all landscapes, it has a north-facing slope and a south-facing slope, a shaded side and a sunlit side. It has yin and it has yang. The yin organs in traditional Chinese medicine are the dense, solid, blood-filled organs, the heart, the liver, the spleen, the lungs, the kidneys. They store vital substances. They are the repositories of the body's fundamental energies. The yang organs are the hollow organs, the stomach, the large intestine, the small intestine, the gallbladder, the bladder. They receive, transform, and transmit. They are the active processes of what comes in and goes out, but these are not rigid categories. Everything in the body has yin and yang aspects. The surface of the body is more yang than the interior. The upper body is more yang than the lower body. The back is more yang than the front. The day is a yang time for the body. The night is a yin time. And health in this system is not the absence of disease. Health is balance. It is the harmonious, dynamic, ever-adjusting relationship between the yin and yang forces within the body. When yin is excessive and yang is deficient, you feel cold, slow, heavy, dull. You want to sleep all the time. You have no energy for assertion or activity. When yang is excessive and yin is deficient, you feel hot, agitated, dry, restless. Your mind races. You cannot settle. You lie awake at night with too much energy and no place for it to go. Neither is a disease in the Western sense. Neither is caused by a single pathogen or a single deficiency. Both are patterns of imbalance in a system that is designed to balance itself when the system is given what it needs and not forced into configurations it cannot sustain. The treatment in this framework is not to add or subtract a single substance. It is to gently nudge the pattern toward balance, to warm what is too cold or cool what is too hot, to tonify the yin or clear the excess yang, to work with the body's own tendency toward equilibrium rather than against it. This is in many ways closer to what modern systems biology is discovering than it is to what 19th century medicine practiced. The body is not a collection of separate parts, each to be fixed or replaced independently. The body is a complex, self-regulating system in which everything influences everything else and in which health is a property of the whole, not of any individual component. The Yin-Yang model also has a deeply interesting implication for how we think about illness. If yin and yang are always in relationship, then no state of the body is purely pathological. Even illness is the body's attempt to find balance. Even pain is information. Even the yin of exhaustion after a long illness is not a problem to be solved, but a necessary phase of restoration. A state in which the body is doing the quiet, hidden yin work of rebuilding. This does not mean we should not treat illness or that suffering is simply to be accepted, but it does mean that the aggressive, yang-only approach to healthcare, in which every symptom is an enemy to be eliminated as fast as possible, may sometimes interfere with the very processes of restoration and recovery it is trying to support. The question the Yin-Yang model asks of medicine is, what is this symptom protecting? What is this restriction conserving? What is this pain trying to communicate? Before you silence it, before you override it, do you understand what the body is doing and why? This is uncomfortable for a medical tradition built around the idea of cure, but it may be one of the most important questions medicine can ask. In 1947, Niels Bohr was knighted by the King of Denmark. Bohr was one of the great architects of quantum mechanics, the most successful and most disturbing scientific theory ever developed. He had spent decades thinking about what quantum mechanics meant, not just mathematically but philosophically, about what it was actually telling us about the nature of reality. When he was knighted, tradition required him to design a coat of arms, a family crest, something that expressed who he was and what he stood for. Bohr chose the Taijitu, the yin-yang symbol, and beneath it he placed a Latin motto, Contraria sunt complementa. Opposites are complementa. This was not decoration. This was a precise philosophical statement, because Bohr had discovered, in the physics of subatomic particles, something that the ancient Chinese had seen in the shadow on a hillside. He had discovered that reality, at its most fundamental level, cannot be described using a single consistent framework, that you need two different, mutually exclusive descriptions, and that both are necessary, and neither is complete without the other. The discovery was this: light is both a wave and a particle. This sounds like a minor technical point, but it is actually a philosophical earthquake. In the Western scientific tradition, logic demands that a thing is either one thing or another. It cannot simultaneously be two contradictory things. If light is a wave, it is not a particle. If it is a particle, it is not a wave. But experiment after experiment showed that light behaved like a wave in some contexts and like a particle in others, not sequentially, not depending on what it really was, but genuinely, inescapably, fundamentally both. Einstein and Infeld wrote about this in 1938. We have two contradictory pictures of reality. Separately, neither of them fully explains the phenomena of light, but together they do. Together they do. This is not a problem to be solved. This is a description of the structure of reality. Reality at the quantum level does not resolve neatly into either or. It lives in the both and space that Yin-Yang philosophy had been pointing at for 2,500 years. Bohr's principle of complementarity says, some properties of a quantum system cannot both be precisely known at the same time. The more precisely you know a particle's position, the less precisely you can know its momentum. The more you pin it down as a particle, the more its wave nature becomes indeterminate. This is not because of the limitations of our measuring instruments. It is because position and momentum, wave and particle, are complementary qualities in the yin-yang sense. You cannot fully inhabit both at once. Choosing to observe one aspect inevitably obscures the other. The physicist David Harrison paraphrased Lao Tzu to make this point. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. And then he wrote, the electron that can be told is not the true electron. Because the moment you pin down an electron, you have committed it to a particular description. You have chosen particle over wave, or wave over particle. And by choosing one, you have necessarily obscured the other. The Japanese physicist Yukawa, when asked by a colleague whether Japanese physicists had the same difficulty as Western physicists in accepting the idea of complementarity, reportedly replied that they did not, because the idea that opposites are complementary rather than contradictory was, to someone educated in East Asian philosophy, not a strange and difficult idea at all. It was, he said, almost obvious. The insight that Bohr put on his coat of arms, the insight that took Western physics decades of quantum experiments to reach, was embedded in a symbol that Chinese farmers had been carrying since before the Zhou dynasty. But here is the question that quantum mechanics leaves us with, the question that keeps physicists and philosophers arguing even today. If reality at the most fundamental level is genuinely complementary, genuinely yin-yang in structure, what does that tell us about the nature of knowledge? If every precise observation of one quality necessarily obscures its complement, then there is no God's eye view, no perspective from which everything can be seen at once, no complete, final, total description of any quantum system. The universe does not allow itself to be fully seen. And maybe that is not a bug. Maybe that is a feature. Maybe the irreducible complementarity of reality, the permanent presence of both yin and yang at the heart of existence, is what keeps the universe from collapsing into a single static state. What keeps it alive, dynamic, generative, endlessly surprising. Carl Jung was not Chinese. He was Swiss, born in 1875, the son of a Protestant minister, trained in the Western medical tradition, and one of the founders of psychoanalysis. He spent the first part of his career as Sigmund Freud's most brilliant student, and the second part of his career developing ideas that went far beyond anything Freud had imagined. But at some point in the middle of his career, Jung began reading the texts of Taoism and Confucianism. He collaborated with the German scholar Richard Wilhelm on a translation of an ancient Taoist alchemical text, and he found in the Chinese concept of yin and yang a vocabulary for something he had been circling around for years. Jung's most famous contribution to psychology is the concept of the shadow. The shadow is not your evil side, or rather, it is not only your evil side. The shadow is the part of yourself that you have decided does not belong to you. The part you have repressed, denied, projected onto others, buried under the weight of who you are trying to be. For most people, the shadow contains things like rage, selfishness, sexual desire, envy, the capacity for cruelty. The things that a well-behaved person in a civilized society learns very early to hide from others and eventually from themselves. But the shadow also contains positive qualities. Spontaneity that was punished in childhood, creativity that was labeled impractical, assertiveness that was shamed into submission, the gifts that the world did not know what to do with, so you learned to hide them too. Jung said that the shadow is the part of yourself that you can reliably identify by noticing what you most dislike, most judge, most fear in other people, because what you cannot accept in yourself, you project onto others. The qualities you have exiled from your own self you locate, with suspicious reliability, in the people around you. And here is where Yin and Yang becomes not just a philosophical concept, but a psychological necessity. If you are predominantly Yang, assertive, rational, structured, in control, then your shadow is Yin. It is receptive, emotional, surrendered, vulnerable, wild, and it will express itself whether you want it to or not. Because Yin does not disappear just because you decide you are only Yang. The seed of Yin is always there, in the dot in the bright half of the symbol. And if you do not acknowledge it, if you do not give it a legitimate way to exist, it will find an illegitimate way. The person who is rigidly controlled in their daily life finds that they drink too much at parties. The person who cannot express vulnerability at home becomes irrationally emotional in trivial situations. The person who cannot acknowledge their own aggression becomes the victim of everyone else's. The shadow, as Jung wrote, is not a demon to be exorcised. It is a part of the self to be integrated. The goal of psychological maturity is not to eliminate the darkness within you, but to enter into a conscious relationship with it, to know your shadow well enough that it is no longer entirely autonomous, entirely hidden, entirely capable of acting through you without your awareness. Jung believed that this integration was not merely useful for the individual, he believed it was necessary for the health of civilization, because the darkness that individuals refuse to own in themselves gets projected onto groups, nations, races, religions. The shadow that is not owned internally becomes the enemy externally. And this, Jung argued, is the psychological mechanism underlying war, genocide, and all collective violence. The projection of the shadow is the mechanism by which human beings have always justified atrocities. By locating all of the evil in the other and none in the self, a group can permit itself to do anything. This is not an abstract point, it is the most practical political observation of the 20th century. And the cure, Jung argued, is not political. It begins internally. It begins with the uncomfortable, lifelong practice of acknowledging the shadow in yourself, of meeting your own darkness with consciousness rather than denial, of taking back the projection. This is Yin-Yang practice, even if Jung did not always use that vocabulary. It is the practice of holding both, of refusing the comfort of pure Yang self-image, of giving the Yin its legitimate place at the table. Jung also developed the concepts of anima and animus, which mapped onto Yin and Yang in a more personal way. The anima is the unconscious feminine element in a man's psyche. The animus is the unconscious masculine element in a woman's psyche. Neither is better or worse. Both are necessary for wholeness, and both operate as an inner counterpart, a complement, a yin to the conscious yang or a yang to the conscious yang. The best way to picture it, as one of Jung's students wrote, is to think of the yin-yang symbol. A man is like the white half, predominantly yang in his conscious orientation, but within him in the white half is a black dot. That is his anima, his inner feminine, the complement without which the yang half is incomplete. A woman is like the black half, predominantly yin in her conscious orientation, but within her is a white dot. That is her animus, her inner masculine, Jung believed that one of the central tasks of the second half of life was to become more consciously related to this inner complement. For a man, this meant developing greater emotional intelligence, greater receptivity, greater connection to the inner life. For a woman, it often meant developing greater assertion, greater engagement with the outer world, greater capacity to act on her own judgments rather than deferring to others. Not to become the opposite, not to become the opposite, not to abandon the yang for the yin or the yin for the yang, but to hold both, to become a fuller, more complete human being by integrating the complement that had been hidden in the shadow. This is not easy work. It requires exactly the kind of quiet, patient, yin-type attention that Western culture, which valorizes yang almost exclusively, makes very difficult. But it is, according to Jung, the only path to what he called individuation, the process of becoming fully and distinctly yourself, not the self that your family approved of, or your culture approved of, or your own earlier idea of yourself demanded, the self that is big enough to hold both sides of the symbol. The question that keeps you awake. Here is the question that has kept philosophers, theologians, and ordinary human beings awake for as long as we have been capable of asking questions. Is evil real? Not in the sense of, does terrible suffering exist? Of course it does. We all know it does. But in the sense of, is evil a substance? Is it a genuine quality of the universe, as real as gravity and as irreducible? Or is evil simply the name we give to the extreme of what would otherwise be a natural continuum? Lao Tzu suggests the second. In the Tao Te Ching, he writes that the distinction between good and evil is not a discovery, but a construction. When we decide that some things are good, we simultaneously create the category of evil. The two judgments are inseparable, Yin and Yang. This seems at first hearing deeply troubling, because if good and evil are not absolute, if they are simply two ends of a continuum, then does that mean that evil is not really evil, that cruelty is not really cruel, that we have no grounds on which to condemn what is condemnable? This is the Dostoevsky problem, the Ivan Karamazov problem. If there is no absolute good, if good and evil are just two complementary aspects of a cosmic balance, then can we really hold anyone responsible? Can we really say that the torturer of children is doing something genuinely wrong? Or are we just expressing a preference? The Taoist answer to this challenge is careful and often misunderstood. Taoism in its deepest form is not saying that nothing matters. It is not saying that good and evil are equally acceptable. It is saying something more subtle, that the rigid binary of pure good versus pure evil is a false map, and that acting from that false map produces more harm than acting from an understanding of the actual terrain. When a society becomes convinced that it has located all the evil outside itself and all the good inside itself, it becomes capable of anything. When a person becomes convinced that they are purely good and their opponent is purely evil, they lose the capacity for the careful, nuanced, yin-type attention that real moral life requires. The Yin-Yang model does not eliminate moral judgment. It transforms it. Instead of asking, is this person good or evil? It asks, what is this pattern of energy, and what does it need in order to become more balanced? Instead of asking, how do we eliminate this evil? It asks, what is this evil a symptom of? What yin quality has been so suppressed that it is now erupting in a destructive way? This is not a comfortable framework for moral action. It is much more comfortable to have a clear enemy. It is much easier to rally people against a defined evil than to invite them into a nuanced investigation of how the evil emerged from an imbalanced system that everyone participated in. But here is the historical evidence. The most catastrophic events in human history have been produced precisely by movements that were convinced they were fighting absolute evil. Movements so certain of their own goodness and their enemy's total evil that any action against that enemy was justified. The Taoist framework, the Yin-Yang framework, offers something more difficult and more useful. The recognition that what looks like pure evil is almost always the explosive, destructive emergence of qualities that were suppressed rather than integrated. The yang that was denied its legitimate yang. The yang that was denied its legitimate yang. The shadow that was never acknowledged becoming the demon that destroys from within. This does not mean that nothing should be opposed. Lao Tzu was not passive. He was fiercely critical of the rulers and ideologies of his time. But his criticism was always directed at the imbalance, not at a supposed intrinsic evil, at the excess of yang without yin, at the attempt to force and control rather than to flow and balance. The question he was always asking was, what is missing? What complementary quality has been excluded? And this question, it turns out, is one of the most powerful diagnostic tools available for understanding both personal suffering and collective violence. Not who is guilty, but what is out of balance. Not how do we eliminate the darkness, but what would it look like to give the darkness its legitimate place so that it stops erupting in illegitimate ways. These are yin questions, patient, receptive, investigative questions. Questions that do not demand immediate answers, but invite a long, slow process of observation and understanding. They are not satisfying questions. They do not give us the clean resolution of a clear enemy and a righteous victory. They give us something more useful and more uncomfortable, a deeper understanding of how we got here and what we might do differently. Step outside tonight, if you can. Or just close your eyes and imagine it. The sky above you, dark but not empty, full of stars which are themselves yin-yang systems, cores of extraordinary heat and pressure, yang in the extreme, surrounded by the cold emptiness of space, yin in the extreme, and the boundary between them, the surface of the star where light is born and released, is the interface between these two extremes. Life, in the form of light, emerges at exactly that boundary, the earth beneath you. The seasons it moves through are the most obvious yin-yang system in our daily lives. Winter, yin, cold, dark, withdrawn, quiet, internal, slow. Summer, yang. Hot, bright, expanded, active, external, fast. And the spring and autumn as the transitions between them, the changing lines in the I Ching hexagram of the year. The tides. The moon pulls the ocean's water toward itself as it passes, and the ocean rises. Yang. Then the moon moves on, and the water falls back. Yin, 6 hours, one way. 6 hours the other, twice a day, everywhere on earth that touches the ocean. An endless, patient, precise alternation. Your own breath. Inhale, yang, active, expanding, taking in, exhale, yin, passive, contracting, releasing. The pause at the top of the inhale, that moment of fullness before the release. The pause at the bottom of the exhale, that moment of emptiness before the next breath. Each pause containing the seed of its opposite. In ecology, yin-yang dynamics appear everywhere, though ecologists do not use that vocabulary. Predator and prey populations oscillate in a pattern that looks remarkably like the Taijitu, drawn across time rather than space. When prey are abundant, predators thrive and their population grows. As predator populations grow, prey populations fall. As prey populations fall, predator populations begin to decline from lack of food. As predators decline, prey populations recover. As prey recover, predators begin to recover, and so the cycle continues. Neither population is destroying the other. Both are necessary for the health of the ecosystem. The prey keep the vegetation from being overrun. The predators keep the prey from overrunning everything else. The dance of yin and yang between them is what maintains the vitality of the whole. In geology, the yin-yang of tectonic activity. The mountains being built by the compression of continental plates. Yang, rising, assertive, dramatic. And the patient, yin work of erosion, water and wind and time wearing them back down, returning them to the sea, where they will eventually be subducted and eventually re-emerge as new mountains. Nothing is permanently yang, nothing is permanently yin. Everything is in a phase of a cycle. The mountain that looks permanent to a human lifetime is, on geological timescales, in the middle of a process of yin-yang alternation as regular and predictable as the tides. The universe itself, according to some cosmological models, operates this way. The Big Bang was yang, explosive, expansive, the maximum expression of outward moving energy. And the universe is still yang, still expanding, still moving outward from that initial explosion. But there is dark energy, that mysterious substance or property of empty space that we do not understand, which seems to be accelerating the expansion. And some physicists wonder whether the universe's expansion will eventually slow and reverse, whether the yin of gravity will ultimately overcome the yang of expansion, and whether the universe will eventually contract back toward a singularity, a big crunch that is the complement of the Big Bang. And then some theorists propose, from that singularity, another Big Bang, another cycle of yang expansion, another universe. The Tao that produced one, that produced two, that produced three, that produced the 10,000 things, over and over, without beginning, without end. If this is true, we are not living at the center of a story with a beginning and an ending. We are living in the middle of an oscillation, in one of the yang phases of a cycle so vast that the entire age of our universe is smaller relative to the whole than a single heartbeat. That is either terrifying or comforting depending on where you are in your own yin-yang cycle tonight. People misunderstand balance. When they think about yin-yang balance, they often imagine a static thing, an equal and perfect distribution of qualities. 50% yin, 50% yang, holding steady in a perpetual state of harmony. But this is not what the Taijitu represents. It never was. Look at the symbol again in your mind. The curved line between the two halves is not straight. It is not a vertical bisector. It curves in a specific way that represents not a fixed boundary, but a moving one. The line is a wave, and a wave is by definition something in motion. Balance in the yin-yang sense is dynamic. It is not a state you arrive at and then maintain. It is a process of constant responsive adjustment. Like riding a bicycle, you are not balanced because you have found the perfectly stable position. You are balanced because you are constantly making small corrections in both directions. And the sum of those corrections over time is a journey forward. Or like a thermostat, the room is not kept at a comfortable temperature by being held rigidly at 20 degrees. It is kept comfortable by a constant process of responding to deviations. Too cold, the heat comes on. Too hot, it goes off. The balance is an emergent property of the ongoing process of response, not a fixed state. This is a profoundly different idea from the Western ideal of equilibrium. Western thinking has often imagined the goal as a state of perfect stability, a final condition of peace and resolution, the end of conflict, the resolution of tension. But the Yin-Yang model says that tension is not a problem to be resolved. It is the engine of life. Remove the tension between yin and yang, and you do not have peace. You have stasis, you have death. This has implications for how we think about conflict in relationships. The relationships that are most alive, most growth-producing, most generative, are rarely the ones with no tension. They are the ones where the tension is dynamic rather than destructive, where the yin and yang of two people are in dialogue rather than war, where each person's qualities genuinely complement rather than merely tolerating the others. A relationship where both people are entirely yang is a power struggle with no winner. A relationship where both are entirely yin is beautiful but static, comfortable but not growing. The relationships that endure and develop are the ones where the yin and yang between two people are in a genuine, evolving, dynamic balance. And this takes us to a point that is genuinely difficult. Genuine balance requires that you be willing to inhabit the quality that is not your natural one, that the predominantly yang person learns, with effort and practice, to become yin, to receive rather than give, to listen rather than speak, to wait rather than act, and that the predominantly yin person learns with equal effort and equal practice to become yang, to initiate rather than respond, to speak rather than listen, to act rather than wait, not permanently, not as a replacement for your natural tendency, but as a supplement to it, as the practice of wholeness. This is why many of the great wisdom traditions, not only Taoism, but also many forms of Buddhism, Stoicism, and other contemplative traditions, place such emphasis on practices that are the complement of the practitioner's natural temperament. The man of action is asked to sit still. The intellectual is asked to work with his hands. The person who lives entirely in the mind is asked to tend a garden, to knead bread, to pay attention to the body. The person who is consumed by the physical is asked to sit and read, to think, to attend to the inner life, not because your natural mode is wrong, but because a life that inhabits only half of the symbol is a half-life in the deepest sense. The goal is not to arrive, it is to keep moving, to keep responding, to maintain, through continuous adjustment, the dynamic aliveness that is the Yin-Yang definition of health. Here is a paradox that lives at the heart of the Yin-Yang model. The act of fully understanding this philosophy changes your relationship to the philosophy. Let me explain. The Tao Te Ching warns constantly against forcing, against grasping, against the Yang-type insistence on getting something, and this includes getting understanding. The person who pursues wisdom aggressively, who grips the concepts tightly, and demands clear answers, is approaching the Yin-Yang model in the most Yang possible way. And in doing so, they miss the Yin dimension of the understanding itself. Real understanding of this philosophy comes in the way understanding always comes to Yin, quietly, indirectly, through receptivity rather than effort, through sitting with the questions rather than demanding answers, through allowing the ideas to settle rather than wrestling them into submission. This is why Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching in paradoxes, not to be mysterious or difficult, but because paradox is the most accurate form of language for a reality that is fundamentally both and rather than either-or. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The understanding that can be grasped is not the deep understanding. To know others is wisdom. To know yourself is enlightenment. And here the paradox is subtle. Knowing yourself requires encountering the parts of yourself that you did not know were there, including the parts that contradict what you thought you knew. The highest good is like water. Water benefits 10,000 things and does not compete. It stays in lowly places that people reject. Water is yin. And the highest yang, the most effective action, the most powerful virtue, comes from embracing the yin, from going low, from not competing, from serving without demand for recognition. This is the paradox of leadership as Lao Tzu understood it. The best leader is the one who is barely noticed, who creates the conditions for others to thrive and then steps back, whose presence enables rather than dominates. When the best leader's work is done, Lao Tzu writes, "The people say, we did it ourselves." This is deeply countercultural. In most human societies, leadership is understood as yang, assertive, visible, commanding, claiming credit. Lao Tzu says that this is the least effective form of leadership. The most effective leadership is the yin form, creating space, removing obstacles, enabling, and then stepping back. And here is where the paradox becomes specifically interesting for this conversation, for this particular late-night journey you are on. The practice of understanding yin and yang is itself a yin practice. You are not reading this to get answers. You are listening to let ideas settle in you, to let questions surface slowly, to let understanding arrive from below the level of effort and grasping, Sleep itself is the most yin of all the daily activities. It is the withdrawal of consciousness into the interior, the turning away from the yang world of doing and toward the yin world of being, the surrender of control, the opening to dreams, to the unconscious, to the parts of yourself that only speak when the yang mind is quiet enough to hear them. And the ideas that settle in you as you sleep are often the most important ones. Not the ones you fought to understand, but the ones that found you when you were not looking. Perhaps that is why these sleep philosophy channels exist. Perhaps there is wisdom in the recognition that certain kinds of understanding require the yin state of receptivity, and that the way to prepare for that understanding is not to study harder, but to soften, to quiet, to let the knowing arrive as water arrives, by going where the ground is lowest. There is a thing in the Yin-Yang tradition called Wu-Wei, which we have already mentioned, but it applies here in a specific and personal way. Wu-Wei is not laziness. It is the art of acting from the still center, rather than from the agitated surface, of responding to what is actually happening, rather than to what you are afraid might happen or what you wish would happen. And the still center, the yin center from which effective action arises, is only accessible when you are not forcing, not grasping, not demanding. It is accessible, for most people, most reliably, at the edge of sleep, in the hypnagogic state, that strange liminal space between waking and dreaming, where the yang analytical mind begins to relax its grip and the yin imaginative mind begins to surface. Some of the most significant insights in the history of art, science, and philosophy have arrived in this state, not because the person was trying, because they had stopped trying. The yin of understanding arrives when the yang of effort steps aside. There is a way in which entire cultures can be understood as expressions of predominantly yin or predominantly yang orientations toward reality. Ian McGilchrist, the British psychiatrist and philosopher, has written extensively about the difference between the left hemisphere and right hemisphere of the human brain. The left hemisphere tends toward focus, analysis, abstraction, and control. The right hemisphere tends toward broad attention, connection, context, and openness. He argues controversially and compellingly that Western modernity has become increasingly left hemisphere dominant, increasingly yang, increasingly focused on control, analysis, and the manipulation of the world. And he argues that this imbalance, this excess of yang, is producing exactly the symptoms that yin-yang theory would predict: brittleness, anxiety, a loss of connection to meaning, an inability to hold complexity, a narrowing of what counts as real. The dominant Western philosophical tradition from Descartes onward has been yang in its structure: analytical, systematic, focused on clear distinctions, committed to the idea that truth can be arrived at through rigorous step-by-step rational process, the kind of truth that can be demonstrated, proven, and communicated in propositions. The East Asian philosophical tradition has tended more toward the yin, not toward irrationality or mysticism, but toward a different epistemology, a different theory of how we know things, one that values indirect knowing, contextual understanding, felt sense, and the wisdom that comes from long, patient observation rather than controlled experiment. Neither is complete without the other, and the best thinking in any tradition tends to find ways to hold both. The best Western science is not purely yang. It contains the yin of open observation, of receptivity to anomalous data, of willingness to abandon a theory when the evidence requires it. And the best Eastern wisdom is not purely yin. It contains the yang of precision, of willingness to make distinctions, of taking positions and defending them. The problem arises when one mode becomes so dominant that the other is no longer available. When yang rationalism becomes so entrenched that even asking certain questions, the yin questions, the contextual, relational, what does this mean? Questions, feels like irrationalism. Or when yin acceptance becomes so pervasive that even necessary yang action, the making of distinctions, the willingness to say no, is labeled aggression. The Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel, in his lectures on justice, keeps returning to a question that is fundamentally a yin-yang question. Can we reduce everything to a single measure? Can we express all values in the same currency? His students consistently feel that something is lost when you try to put a dollar value on a human life or a community or a sacred site, not because the measure is technically incorrect, but because the act of applying a single measure to everything collapses the complementarity, the irreducible two-ness of reality into a false oneness. Some things are yang, tradable, fungible, quantifiable, and some things are yin, particular, irreplaceable, resistant to comparison. A civilization that can only see the yang things, the measurable, the exchangeable, the manageable, is missing half of reality, and what it is missing will find ways to make itself known one way or another, in depression, in addiction, in political rage, in spiritual crisis. The yin does not simply disappear because the culture ignores it. It goes underground and erupts. The question for our civilization, perhaps the central question of this historical moment, is whether we can find a way to integrate the yin more consciously before it erupts more destructively, not to abandon the yang, not to retreat into a romantic idealization of pre-modern, pre-industrial life, but to restore the balance, to create space for the yin qualities, receptivity, slowness, depth, connection, mystery, the things that cannot be optimized, cannot be scaled, cannot be measured, within a world that has become very good at optimizing, scaling, and measuring. This is not a political program. It is a practice. And like all practices, it begins not in society, but in the individual. It begins with you, lying in the dark, listening. We have traveled a long way tonight from a hillside in ancient China, where the word yin first meant the shadow on the north-facing slope, to the most fundamental discoveries of quantum physics, through the depth of the Jungian unconscious, into the moral questions that have no clean answers, across the landscape of the human body, of natural cycles, of cultural history, and now we return, not to a conclusion. The Yin-Yang model does not produce conclusions. It produces a way of seeing, a way of attending, a posture toward reality that is both softer and more accurate than the hard edges of either-or thinking. Here is what we have found. Reality is dual in its structure, not in the sense that everything comes in exactly two kinds of things, but in the sense that every quality we can name, every experience we can have, every phenomenon we can observe, exists in relationship to its complement. And without that relationship, without that complementary other, the quality itself would not exist. This duality is not a conflict. It is a dance. It is the way the universe keeps itself alive and dynamic and generative. It is the structure that prevents reality from collapsing into a gray, undifferentiated sameness in which nothing has a name and nothing can be felt. The symbol that expresses this most precisely is the Taijitu, the yin-yang symbol, which shows not two enemies but two partners, each containing a seed of the other, each flowing into the other in a motion that is never static, never finished, never resolved into a final state. This idea is not just beautiful, it is useful, it changes how you see difficulty. Difficulty is not the opposite of growth. It is the yin phase of a cycle that includes growth, the contraction before the expansion, the night before the dawn. Not a mistake, not a punishment, but a phase. And within every difficulty, according to the white dot in the black half, there is already the seed of its resolution. It changes how you see your own shadow, the parts of yourself you cannot accept, cannot acknowledge, cannot give a legitimate place, do not disappear. They become the black dot in the white half, always there, always pressing, always seeking expression. The practice of acknowledging them, of entering into a conscious relationship with them, is not weakness. It is the most yang kind of courage. the courage to look at what you would rather not see. It changes how you see other people. The qualities that most disturb you in others are, more often than not, the ones you have most completely suppressed in yourself. Your strongest moral judgments are sometimes maps of your shadow, not always, but often enough that it is worth pausing when you find yourself most certain that someone else is purely wrong, and asking, what am I not seeing in myself? It changes how you see rest and action. Our culture valorizes action almost exclusively. Busyness is a virtue. Rest is tolerated, but it must be productive rest. Sleep is important, but mainly as fuel for the next day's work. Lao Tzu would recognize this immediately as an excess of yang, and he would point out gently that a tree cannot grow above the ground if it does not also grow below it, that every yang must be matched by a corresponding yin, that the quality of your action depends on the quality of your rest, that the depth of your engagement with the world depends on the depth of your withdrawal from it. You cannot be permanently yang. No one can. It is not a failure of willpower. It is a law of nature. The yin comes for everyone, in the form of exhaustion, in the form of illness, in the form of loss, in the form of the long dark night that arrives when everything you have been sustaining through sheer yang force finally, mercifully, stops being sustainable. The question is not whether you will encounter the yin. The question is whether you will encounter it consciously as a necessary phase of a cycle you understand, or unconsciously as a disaster you did not see coming. The Taoist tradition does not promise that understanding yin and yang will make your life easier. It promises something more honest, that understanding the structure of the dance makes you a better dancer, that knowing which phase of the cycle you are in changes your relationship to it, that recognizing the complementary nature of what seems to be your enemy changes how you relate to it, and sometimes that is enough. Not to solve the problem, not to eliminate the difficulty, but to hold it differently, to be in relationship with it rather than at war with it, to recognize the seed of resolution already present in the middle of the difficulty, if only you can be quiet enough to feel it. Right now, in this moment, you are doing something that the yang-obsessed world around you does not fully value. You are being yin. You are receiving rather than producing. You are listening rather than speaking. You are letting yourself be moved by ideas rather than moving ideas around to suit your purposes. You are, in the deepest sense, resting. And rest is not the absence of meaning. Rest is the yin complement of action, without which action loses its quality and its purpose. Rest is the dark half without which the light has no contrast and no depth. Rest is the silence without which the music has no shape. As you move towards sleep now, if sleep is coming, or as you lie in the quiet dark, if it is not quite yet, let the ideas from tonight settle as sediment settles in still water, not grasped, not analyzed, just settled. The Yin-Yang model does not demand that you do anything with it. It only invites you to see that the difficulty and the relief are partners, that the loss and the finding are two phases of one process, that the darkness you carry is not your shame but your complement, that the person you are failing to be is the yang to your current yin, or the yin to your current yang, and that neither is the whole truth about you, that you are, like everything that exists, an expression of both, that somewhere in you tonight there is a white dot in the black half, and that it is enough, that you are already in the midst of becoming what you need to become. The Tao does not hurry, and yet everything gets done. Water wears away stone, not because water is stronger, because water is patient, because water is yin, and water eventually finds the sea. Thank you for spending this time here, for traveling through 2,500 years of one of humanity's deepest ideas in the quiet of the night, when the yang mind softens and the yin mind begins to hear. We have been to China, to Denmark, to Zurich. We have stood on hillsides and in physics laboratories, and in the middle of the human psyche. We have asked questions that do not have clean answers. And we have let those questions be questions without forcing them into premature resolution. This is maybe meaning. The name is not a hedge. It is not uncertainty for its own sake. It is the honest acknowledgement that meaning is the kind of thing that arrives through the yin door quietly when you are not gripping. That the questions that matter most cannot be answered in a single session. That the understanding you are looking for might already be here, settling in you right now as you rest, as you breathe, as you let the words become something other than words. If you are still awake, the next episode is waiting for you. If you are on your way to sleep, go gently. The night is yin, and the yin is where the seeds wait. Good night.